I had pictured the moment so many times, you'd think I was rehearsing a movie scene. Me, telling him the news, the biggest news of our lives, maybe over dinner, maybe while curled up on the couch. I imagined his face lighting up, the way people describe it in those feel-good stories. But when I finally told Daniel I was pregnant, all that played out was silence. He just stared at me, as if I'd said something in a foreign language. At first, I told myself he was just surprised, caught off guard. But then came the words, "I'll never forget. It's not mine." Just like that. No pause, no hesitation. And it felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I remember standing there, still holding the test in my hand, thinking surely I'd misheard. But no, he meant it. He meant every word. And the look in his eyes wasn't confusion. It was accusation. Cold and deliberate. He pulled away after that. Physically, emotionally, every way that mattered. He wouldn't hold my hand. Wouldn't even sit next to me without shifting in discomfort. And then the rumors started. I could feel them in the way people stopped calling, in the awkward pauses when I entered a room. He told his family, our friends, people I loved, that I'd cheated, that the baby wasn't his. And just like that, I went from excited mom-to-be to whispered headline. I tried to reach him, to reason with him, to remind him who we were before this. But it was like talking to a wall. He wouldn't even look at me when he said it. Maybe get a test. It wasn't advice, it was punishment. A cold way to say, I don't believe you. That night, I sat in our bed, the same bed where we once dreamed about the future, and felt like I didn't know the man beside me. He planted a seed of doubt and watered it with cruelty. I started second-guessing everything. Not just our marriage, but myself, my memories, my instincts. I'd lie awake at night replaying the past few months, wondering if I'd missed some sign, some moment where the ground began to shift beneath us. But nothing made sense. There hadn't been another man. There hadn't even been space for one. I was working. I was home. I was trying so hard to be everything. A good wife, a future mom. And somehow, none of it mattered. The worst part wasn't his anger. It was the indifference. The way he'd walk past me in the hallway like I was a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. Some days I'd catch him looking at me, not with hatred, but worse, with disgust, as if just existing near me was a burden he hadn't signed up for. He stopped saying we and ours. The nursery plans, the baby name conversations, gone. I was alone in a house full of silence and stares. People I loved started pulling away too. His sister, who used to call me every weekend, now replied with cold, clipped texts. Our friends stopped inviting us to dinners. And when I did see them, their smiles felt tight, their questions loaded. How are you holding up? They'd ask, eyes darting to my belly, then to him. No one said it outright, but I knew what they were thinking, what he had told them. That maybe I wasn't as sweet or loyal as I seemed. It was like I was being erased in real time. My reputation, my truth, my voice, stripped away one sideways glance at a time. And the more I tried to fight for us, the more I realized he wasn't fighting at all. He didn't want answers. He wanted out. I just hadn't been ready to see it. But something in me, something raw and maternal and rising, was beginning to stir. And though I didn't know it yet, that would change everything. The thing is, I wasn't just grieving a betrayal. I was grieving a version of him that maybe never existed. I kept thinking about the man who held my hair when I had the flu, who danced with me in the kitchen after too much wine, who once cried when my father passed. Where did he go? Had he been a performance all along? Or did something in him break the moment he realized he couldn't control everything, even the timing of new life? I found myself apologizing for things I hadn't done, walking on eggshells in my own home, smiling through nausea, cooking dinner I knew he wouldn't eat. Every now and then, I'd catch my reflection in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. There was this dullness in her eyes, this ache that didn't fade. And I hated that pregnancy. Something so beautiful and fragile was now tangled up in shame and suspicion. Still, I held on to hope like it was the last thread keeping me from unraveling completely. I kept thinking, once the baby comes, once he holds them, he'll understand. He'll know. But the more time passed, the more I saw it. This wasn't confusion. This was willful cruelty. He wasn't lost. He was choosing to hurt me. And that realization cut deeper than all the whispers and silences combined, because it meant I wasn't just alone. I was deliberately abandoned. So I started writing everything down. The coldness, the comments, the days he didn't come home, claiming work, but offering no explanation. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet. I just knew I couldn't let myself forget. Not when he was so busy rewriting the story to cast me as the villain. I didn't have the strength to fight back. Not yet. But I had something else. A baby growing inside me, and a quiet, burning promise that I wouldn't let this be the ending. The human body is resilient. That's what the doctors always say. But mine began to unravel under the pressure. I started waking up dizzy, drenched in sweat, heart pounding like I'd been running. Some mornings I'd stand up too fast and the whole world would tilt. Other times it tilted for no reason at all. I'd cling to furniture like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. And in those moments, the fear was sharp. What if I lose this baby? The stress wasn't just in my head. It was in my blood, my muscles, my bones. My doctor called it a high-risk pregnancy brought on by emotional trauma. She said it gently, like wrapping glass in cloth. I remember nodding, pretending to understand. But inside, it shattered something in me. I wasn't just dealing with a cruel husband or cold stares. I was carrying a life inside me, while carrying a grief I couldn't explain to anyone. Daniel didn't come to appointments anymore. He'd stopped asking how I was feeling. Every time I ended up in the ER, he acted like it was an inconvenience, not a crisis. Again? He said once when I told him I was spotting and couldn't feel movement. I'll never forget the way he exhaled, as if I was being dramatic, as if fear wasn't already clawing at me from the inside out. He left for a business trip the next morning. I started journaling more, writing down everything. The missed calls, the days he didn't check in, the way my stomach twisted when he touched his phone more than my belly. It became a ritual. A way to prove, if not to him, then to myself, that this wasn't in my head. That I wasn't crazy or hormonal or imagining the distance. I was being erased in real time. And I was clinging to ink and paper as my only proof that I was still here. I remember one night in particular. The air in the house was heavy, almost too still, like even the walls were holding their breath. I was lying on the couch, propped up with pillows, trying to ease the cramping. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching. I just needed noise. Something to drown out the silence that had replaced my marriage. Daniel wasn't home, again, and all I could think was, what if something happens while he's gone? That night I ended up in the hospital. The contractions were coming early, erratic but sharp, like my body didn't know if it was ready to give up or fight. I lay there under the cold fluorescent lights, monitors strapped to my belly, trying to steady my breathing. A nurse rubbed my arm, told me to stay calm. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. I hadn't even packed a hospital bag. I wasn't supposed to be this close yet. It was too soon. And I was alone. When the doctor came in, she looked at me with that tight, practiced sympathy, the kind you only see in people who've delivered both joy and heartbreak in the same day. You need to rest, she said. Not just physically, emotionally, or this baby might come before it's ready. I nodded, like I understood, but inside, I was screaming. How do you rest when your life is crumbling and no one around you seems to care? I stayed overnight, hooked up to IVs and machines that beeped in rhythm with my panic. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined my baby, tiny and fragile, clinging to life inside a body that was running on fumes. And in that sterile, sterile room, I whispered a promise I didn't know how I'd keep. Hold on, baby. He won't win. I don't care what it takes. He won't take this from us. Coming home from the hospital wasn't the relief I hoped for. The silence was louder than ever. No flowers, no questions, just a sticky note on the fridge. Back Thursday, work dinner. As if I hadn't just spent the night praying not to lose our child. As if I were a coworker he barely remembered to inform. I stared at that note for a long time, hand resting on my stomach, wondering how the man who once kissed my forehead every morning had disappeared without ever leaving. Something changed in me after that. Not all at once, not like a lightning bolt, but slowly, like dawn bleeding into the edges of night. I stopped hoping he'd come back around. I stopped excusing his behavior to others, and I started keeping track of everything. Not just in my journal, but in my mind, in my body. The tone of his voice, the absences, the way he seemed less like a husband and more like a shadow walking through someone else's life. There was one morning I'll never forget. I was making tea, my hands trembling just enough to rattle the spoon against the mug. He walked in, grabbed his keys, barely mumbled a morning, and left. No glance at my belly, no goodbye. And as the door shut behind him, I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood there, heat rising in my chest, realizing I was carrying more than a child. I was carrying truth, and truth doesn't ask for permission. I went back to the hospital a few weeks later for a routine checkup. The nurse smiled when she saw me, but her eyes lingered too long. "Still hanging in there?" she asked softly. I nodded. What else could I say? I was hanging on by threads, stitching together a sense of control where there was none. But even as I lay back on that table, heartbeat echoing in the room, I whispered it again to the life inside me. "Hold on, baby. He won't win." When the day finally came, I wasn't thinking about revenge or proof or redemption. I was thinking about breathing. About holding on long enough to hear that first cry. Labor was long, messy, terrifying, and also the most sacred thing I've ever experienced. I felt everything and nothing at once. And when the nurse finally placed that tiny, perfect body on my chest, the whole world collapsed into a single moment. They were here. We were here. I named them after my mother, the only woman who ever taught me what unconditional love looked like. She used to say, "Truth needs no defense." I thought of her as I looked down at those little eyes blinking up at me, the tiniest hand curling around my finger. For the first time in months, the storm quieted. No accusations, no noise. Just that soft, rhythmic breath of a new beginning resting on my skin. And I let myself feel proud. I had survived him. The hospital room filled with flowers, but not from Daniel. No calls, no visit. Just a text that said, "Let me know when you're ready to do the test." It hit me like a slap. No congratulations, no how are you. Just the same old shadow trying to cast doubt on something he already knew. So I made the call myself, scheduled the DNA test before I even left the hospital. Not for him, not to win him back, but to document the truth I already carried in my arms. The results came a few days later, sealed in an envelope that felt heavier than it should have. I sat at the kitchen table, baby sleeping nearby, heart steady for the first time in a while. I opened it with shaking fingers. But I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. Because I already knew. 99.9%. He was the father. He always had been. And somehow, even with science on my side, the real victory wasn't the number. It was that I no longer needed his belief to validate my truth. I didn't rush to show him the results. Not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to be calm when I did. I wanted to look him in the eye without trembling, without rage. When I finally called him, his voice was dry, clipped. He asked if I had news. I told him I did, and that he should come see for himself. Maybe part of me hoped, even then, that he'd show a flicker of regret, that he'd hold our child and realize what he almost threw away. He didn't ask to hold the baby. He barely looked at them. Just walked in, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room like he didn't recognize his own life. I handed him the envelope without a word. He opened it, standing by the door, like he was already halfway out of this conversation. I watched his eyes flick down the page, scan the numbers, and then nothing. No apology, no gasp, just a slow blink, like he'd just confirmed what he already knew. That was the moment it all snapped into place. This wasn't a man who believed I cheated. This was a man who needed people to believe it. Because if they didn't, if the truth came out, then all the damage he caused, the isolation, the humiliation, the cruelty, would be exposed for what it was. Intentional. Not confusion, not fear, but calculated detachment from the woman carrying his child. It chilled me more than the accusation ever did. He mumbled something, I think it was okay, and tried to hand the paper back. I didn't take it. Let him carry that proof for once. Let him hold something real. He stood there for another second, then turned to leave, as if nothing life-changing had just occurred. And as the door clicked shut, I held my baby closer, whispering words I hadn't dared to speak out loud before. He gambled on my silence, but I'm about to become louder than ever. After he left, I sat in that stillness for a long time. Not grieving, not anymore. Processing. There's a difference. I looked around the apartment, the one we once picked out together, and I realized how much I had shrunk myself to fit the silence he'd created. But now I had something he didn't. Not just a child, not just proof. I had a truth with teeth. And the paper he tried to toss aside? That was the beginning, not the end. I started printing copies of everything. The DNA results, screenshots of texts, notes from my doctor about the stress-related complications. I organized them into folders, labeled and time-stamped. Not because I planned to beg anyone to believe me. Those days were gone. This was for me. For the woman who once begged him to see her. For the mother who almost broke under the weight of his absence. For every lie he let fester in rooms I no longer entered. The most heartbreaking part wasn't what he did. It was how many people accepted it. How quickly they turned their backs, whispered their theories, nodded along with his version of things. But the truth? The truth is a patient thing. It doesn't beg. It waits. And now, it was fully awake. I wasn't just a woman recovering from betrayal anymore. I was a mother standing on solid ground, with evidence in one hand and purpose in the other. That night, I lit a candle and wrote one final line in my journal. He knew all along, and now, so will everyone else. I wasn't sure yet what my next step would be. Not exactly. But something had shifted. I wasn't documenting anymore. I was building. And whether he was ready or not, the reckoning was coming. I didn't want revenge. At least not in the way people imagine it. Fire and fury and slashed tires. What I wanted was exposure. Clarity. I wanted every lie he told to peel off like old wallpaper, revealing the rotting truth beneath. So I hired a private investigator. A quiet woman named Mara with a calm voice and a sharp instinct for hidden things. I handed her everything I had and told her the rest was up to her. It didn't take long. In just 3 weeks, she came back with a file so thick I had to sit down to go through it. Hotel receipts, text messages, photos. Some of the women I didn't recognize. One of them I did. Someone I used to call a friend. They'd been meeting for months, while I was in the hospital, while I was bleeding, while I was begging him to come home. I remember flipping through those pages and feeling strangely calm, like I had been bracing for a storm that finally arrived. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I scanned every photo, every timestamp, and I felt this clarity settle into my bones. He wasn't just careless, he was strategic. He isolated me so he could betray me without consequence, and the world believed him because I was quiet, because I was pregnant, because I didn't fight back when I should have. But now I had more than anger. I had evidence, and that changed everything. I met with a lawyer the following week, a woman named Claudia who wore red lipstick and never blinked twice at male arrogance. She flipped through my folder, nodded once, and said, "We'll file immediately, publicly." And just like that, something shifted inside me. Not rage, not vengeance, power. The kind that comes when you stop begging people to see you and start showing them what they chose to ignore. The divorce papers were served on a Tuesday morning. I made sure of it. He'd just returned from another business trip, though now I knew exactly whose bed he'd been in. I imagined his face when the courier handed him the envelope. No warning, no fight. Just legal, undeniable closure with my name stamped in bold. I didn't send a message with it. The silence, for once, would be mine, and it would be deafening. But I didn't stop there. I printed copies of the DNA results, stapled them to photos of him and his mistress, and included polite little notes. Thought you should see the truth firsthand. One went to his parents, another to his boss. A few landed in inboxes of mutual friends who had stopped inviting me to birthdays and baby showers. I wasn't asking for their opinion. I was returning their judgment, gift-wrapped in facts. And then came the moment I'd fantasized about without even realizing it, sending him the final envelope at work. Manila, clean, no return address. Inside, the full truth, printed, dated, undeniable. I pictured him opening it at his desk, face stiffening as realization spread. I hoped he felt what I had felt. Not heartbreak, but exposure. That sinking sensation when you realize someone knows exactly what you did, and they're not staying quiet anymore. That same afternoon, I got a call. His number. I let it ring. Then I blocked it. Because this wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't an opening for closure. This was the consequence of everything he tried to bury. And as I rocked my baby to sleep that night, I whispered gently, more for me than for them, he tried to deny a child. But I denied him everything else. In the weeks that followed, the silence from his side was louder than any apology he could have offered. No messages, no attempts to spin the story. I think he knew there was no version of this he could reshape. I had the receipts, literally. And more than that, I had my voice back. The same people who once ghosted me were now sending hesitant texts, dripping with faux concern. I didn't respond. Let them sit with their silence the way I had to. I started sleeping again. Real, deep sleep. The kind that wraps around you like a blanket you forgot existed. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my baby curled against me, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel panic. I felt peace. This home was quiet, yes, but no longer hollow. It was mine. Ours. And even though everything had changed, it finally felt like the noise in my life matched the truth in my heart. There were hard days too. Days when grief curled at the edges of my strength, whispering that I should have seen it all coming. But I reminded myself, I wasn't weak. I was trusting. And that's not a flaw. That's something he tried to weaponize, and I took it back. Every time I fed my child or read them a story or sat in stillness without fear, I was rebuilding what he tried to break, piece by sacred piece. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and stared at the folder that had started it all, I realized something. I hadn't just collected evidence. I had built an archive of survival. A record of every betrayal, yes, but also of every time I chose to stay standing. The legal fight was still ahead, the custody battle, the alimony hearing. But I wasn't afraid. Because now, I didn't just have proof. I had purpose. The courtroom smelled like cold coffee and old paper, that strange mix of bureaucracy and finality. I sat there in silence, my lawyer beside me, our evidence stacked neatly like bricks. Across the room, Daniel looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just diminished. His suit didn't fit quite right. His eyes darted everywhere but mine. And as the judge entered, I felt something unexpected rise inside me. Not nerves, not fear, peace. The proceedings were clinical, the language sterile, custody, visitation, material contributions, psychological distress. But the truth pulsed beneath every word. My doctor's notes, the DNA test, the documentation of infidelity. It all flowed in sequence, like dominoes clicking into place. And as each piece landed, I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I watched. I listened. And I let the system see the story I had survived. Finally, in full color. When the judge ruled in my favor, full custody, sole decision-making, possession of the home, and substantial alimony based on emotional abuse, I didn't smile. I simply breathed. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a release. A long, slow exhale from the part of me that had held her breath through every insult, every hospital visit, every night spent wondering if I was crazy. I wasn't. I was right. And now it was legal. Daniel didn't say a word. He just stood there, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. No drama, no last-ditch speech, just the weight of consequences catching up to a man who once thought they'd never apply to him. And in that quiet moment, watching him shrink into his own choices, I realized something. Some justice doesn't roar. It just quietly, irrevocably arrives. After the ruling, people started treating me differently. Some offered apologies wrapped in awkward small talk. Others just stared, unsure if I was the same woman they had once quietly doubted. But I wasn't interested in apologies. I didn't need their validation anymore. What I needed, and what I finally had, was space to breathe, to heal, to dream again without the shadow of his disbelief clouding every corner of my life. The house felt different, too. Lighter, like it had been holding its own breath for months. I began rearranging furniture, painting walls, making the space reflect who I was now, not who I had been with him. Each change felt symbolic, like tearing down old memories and building something that belonged to me and my child alone. It wasn't just nesting, it was reclaiming. Room by room, I was planting reminders of survival in the walls. It didn't take long for the next step to make itself known. I started a foundation, modest at first, for women going through high-risk pregnancies while facing emotional abandonment. I called it Proof of Life, because that's what I had become, a living, breathing contradiction to every lie told about me. And if I could offer someone else even a fraction of the support I never got, maybe that would be the real justice, the kind that multiplies. People asked me how I had the strength. I never really knew how to answer that. Strength isn't something you find. It's something you build, when the other option is falling apart. And as I stood in the middle of my new office, baby in one arm, donor forms in the other, I realized this wasn't about getting back at anyone anymore. It was about reaching forward, lifting someone else up from the same place I once drowned in. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a women's health event. It wasn't glamorous, a small community hall, maybe 50 people, but it felt important. I stood behind the podium, hands shaking just a little, my child sitting in the front row with a volunteer gently rocking them. I spoke about high-risk pregnancies, about medical care, about the importance of emotional support, but mostly I spoke about being believed. After the event, a reporter asked if I'd be open to an interview. I said yes, not for the publicity, but because I wanted the story told right. Not sensationalized, not sanitized, just told. She asked gentle, thoughtful questions. About the pregnancy, the betrayal, the courtroom. Then she paused, looked me straight in the eye, and asked, "If you could say one thing to the man who once called your child a lie, what would it be?" For a moment, I didn't answer. I looked at my baby. Full cheeks, bright eyes, the picture of resilience. I thought about everything we had been through, everything we had rebuilt. And then, with a calm I hadn't felt in years, I spoke. "I'd tell him this," I said. "Sometimes the blood doesn't just prove paternity, it reveals who was human, and who was never a man at all." The interview ran the next week. I didn't read the comments. I didn't need to. The story wasn't for likes or sympathy. It was for every woman who's ever had to fight twice, once for survival and once for someone to believe she deserved it. And as I folded baby clothes later that night, lights low, the house quiet and full of peace, I smiled at a thought that warmed me from the inside out. We made it, and he can't touch a single piece of it anymore.